Welcome to the second part of sculpting the Goblin Baddie. In this installment, I'm going to show you how to go about preparing the armature for the clay that you'll end up sculpting the entire miniature with. Hey there, welcome to the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host Tom Mason, and I am very excited to continue this series on sculpting the Goblin Baddie. This is the kind of key featured character miniature for my upcoming Kickstarter, the Goblin Menace. And I'm excited to show you more about that. But for now, let's talk about preparing the armature. So if you remember in the last episode, we made the armature, and we did go ahead and add some putty to the miniature ahead of time just to help bulk up the form. But this next stage that we have to do is we have to actually add a thin layer of green stuff putty to over the entire armature. Now the reason we have to do that is I'm going to be sculpting this miniature in Fimo poly clay, and Fimo does not like to stick to anything except itself. So in order to do that, we need to have a layer of a very sticky putty. In this case, Knead-A-Tight green stuff. It's a great versatile material. It spreads on thin and has a long working time. So it allows you to put this very thin skin or film over the entire armature. You need to place this over any bulked out, dry, cured parts of the putty, like I'm doing on this guy's belly, as well as down the legs and feet, on the arms. This is pretty much the rule for any polyclay, with the exception of Bees Putty. Bees Putty has some unique properties that do allow you to apply it directly to the armature. I've done a review of Bees Putty Triple Firm, and where I talk about that a little bit, and I'm going to be doing a review of the new, well, I don't know how new it is now, but of Bees Putty Quadruple Firm in the future, where I'll try and go over this technique a little more. Now I want to clarify that I'm using pure green stuff, not a mix with Aves. This is just pure green stuff, because you do want to keep the basic properties of Knead-A-Tight green stuff. You don't want it to cure faster. You don't want it to cure harder. It's actually good to have some of that flexibility, and there's really nothing stickier than pure green stuff, and you'll need that for the polyclay application. The main tool, well, pretty much the only tool I use during this portion, is a flat chisel color shaper. I use size 0, extra firm, and I want to point out that it is called a color shaper. There are things called clay shapers. It's basically the same. They have silicone tips, but if you try and find this size by searching clay shaper, you most likely will end up with giant versions, which can be used but are a little more difficult when we're working in miniature. Now that I've applied a thin layer of green stuff all over the armature, it's time for the next step. While the putty is still wet, while the green stuff is still uncured, you need to start doing this next step. So basically block out a good chunk of time, because you have to put a layer of green stuff over everything and then immediately start putting a layer of Fimo Professional or whatever polyclay you're using. This is actually a really tricky part of the sculpting process, especially when you're starting out, because it takes a bit of control and confidence to get the green stuff on there thin enough so it's not shifting and moving around a lot while it's still soft and workable. And you're also trying to get a nice thin layer of the Fimo there so that you're not over bulking the figure. You want to be able to have those thin wrists and ankles and some other areas, especially if you're working on a more even just a regular human, for instance, versus a character like this larger chunky goblin. You'll notice I've shifted away from using the color shaper, and now I've started to use a large burnishing tool. This is specifically the Wax 5, which is my favorite of the large burnishing tools out there. You can use anything, but I really like it. It's got a great fine tip but a nice rounded backside, and the reason I go to this is a couple reasons. One, When you're working with polyclay, it won't stick to your tools, so you can just use a metal tool and it will glide right over. The other reason is because it's metal, it has a much firmer touch to it, so you can press and manipulate and push the clay around a lot better. And if you have a little extra bit like you just saw there, you can just pinch it off and try and get everything down a little thinner. Add a little extra layer of the Fimo if you start seeing too much green stuff showing through. That's really all there is to it. Just keep adding the Fimo or the polyclay until the entire miniature is basically all the green stuff is covered with the polyclay. Once you're done with that, just set it aside and let it cure. Let the green stuff cure. The top layer of Fimo will stay soft and you'll be able to add additional clay to it later. And do not, I repeat, do not put this in any sort of putty oven or heating element to try and speed up the curing process. If you do that, you'll also cook your Fimo, and then you won't be able to add successive layers of polyclay to the model. It won't stick. So you're just going to have to set it down, leave it alone for a good while. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention. Don't feel like you have to do the entire miniature in one go. You don't have to put all the green stuff on a whole miniature and then all of the Fimo on the whole miniature. If you aren't comfortable doing that, if you feel like you can only tackle one leg at a time or one or two arms at once, then just do that. You can always just add some more putty, some more green stuff, and then add the layer of Fimo on afterwards. That's pretty much everything you need to know about preparing the armature for sculpting. But I did want to go over one last little technique you can use. And this is a bit more of an advanced one, but it can be extremely useful if you do it early on rather than waiting until you've got a lot of detail on your miniature. And that is attaching extra items, primarily things you've sculpted in putty or some other form that they're hard, they're solid, they're essentially finished, and you want to attach them to your miniature. So what you saw me doing initially was I added a little bit of putty onto the hand after the whole armature had set up, so I wouldn't accidentally mess up the work I had already done. And now I'm adding it on here to this club, and that will give a nice double sticky area for both elements to really stick together onto. I'm also going to put a little bit of green stuff underneath the mace just to help stick it down to the base and make sure it doesn't shift on me. And once it's situated, go ahead and just put a little bit of Fimo over all of the green stuff, at least the parts that you want to be able to sculpt on, just like you did before for the rest of the armature. This next part was a little trickier. I had a piece of meat that I sculpted and I wanted to have it strapped to his belt. So in order to do that, I needed to try and mount it to his leg here. So what you see me doing here is I'm scraping away all the Fimo that's covering up the green stuff. You want to leave the green stuff there because that'll give you just even more material to attach to. But you want to clean that off so there's none of the soft, unbaked polyclay on top of the green stuff. Once you do that, you just get a little bit of fresh green stuff and start to build it up. Try and get it a good amount on there, because whenever you're adding kind of a large loose item like this, it's very easy for it to break off. So I actually added it in two places. I've got it on the leg, and I knew that the extra piece of equipment would actually touch the arm as well. So I ended up putting it in between there so that it could have just a little bit more support. The other thing you need to be mindful about when doing this is, because your armature is such a thinner figure and form than you'll end up with in the end, you need to kind of mentally think about where it's going to be placed. That's why you saw me building up quite a lot of putty, because I needed to make sure it stood out from the body enough to not end up getting buried when I finished sculpting. Well, there you have it. That's how you prepare an armature. I'll see you on the next installment, but until then, keep sculpting. Thanks for watching the Mini Sculpting Super Show. If you'd like to learn more about sculpting miniatures, subscribe and hit the notification button so you can find out whenever I post a new video, or check out some of the other videos on screen. If you'd like to support the show, check out my Patreon or head on over to my web store at thetommason.com.